My name is Bayle Conrad, and I am a program coordinator at Harborview Medical Center. This is the first in a series of short presentations about SSI, or Supplemental Security Income, for newly arrived refugees. This presentation discusses eligibility and how to start an SSI application for your client. Let's start by talking about what SSI is. SSI stands for Supplemental Security Income, and it's a government benefit administered by the Social Security Administration. SSI provides monthly payments to those with disabilities and older adults who are 65 years or older, who have little or no income or resources. The maximum monthly SSI payment for 2024 is $943 for an individual and $1,415 for a couple. So let's go into more detail about who is eligible to receive SSI. Like I mentioned on the previous slide, you must be disabled or age 65 and older, while also having limited resources in order to qualify. If you're serving a client who is 65 years or older, they will qualify as long as they meet income restrictions. For clients that have a disability, the process is much more complex, and they must prove that they meet Social Security's definition of the disability for that condition in order to be approved. If you're newer to the SSI process, or you're not sure whether your client would be potentially eligible for these benefits, the Social Security Administration has a few websites that are helpful in sort of preemptively determining whether it's worth applying and whether your client might qualify for SSI. The first website, which is also listed on this slide, is the SSI Eligibility Calculator. This is a website where you can plug in your client's household income, any assets or resources that they have, and determine if they qualify based on the resource limitation. The second link here is called the SSI Blue Book of Medical Conditions. This is a link that goes through all of the conditions that Social Security considers to be potentially disabling and has specific definitions and requirements for each condition that must be met in order for that person's disability to be considered eligible. Some of the information on this medical condition page can be very technical, and as a caseworker, you might not know if your client necessarily meets these conditions, but it's a good place to start. And there will be some information in later presentations in this series about ways that you can work with a primary care provider or other medical provider to help you determine further whether your client would qualify. Both of these links are available in the accompanying SSI guide on page 3 of the guide. So you may have heard the terms SSI and SSDI, and you might be confused about what the difference is between these two acronyms. So I want to go over this briefly. SSI stands for Supplemental Security Income, and like we mentioned or in the previous slide, it's based on income and age or disability. SSDI is Social Security Disability Insurance, and this is based on disability and work credits. Because you're likely working with people who are newly arrived to the US, your clients will usually not qualify for SSDI. What Social Security does is they will usually put in an application for both programs when you are applying or when your client's applying, and they will quickly determine that your client is not eligible for SSDI because they have not worked in the US. This doesn't mean that they're not eligible for SSI. This gets a little confusing because usually your client will receive a denial letter for SSDI, which can look very similar to an SSI denial. So if they're receiving a letter pretty quickly after they've been interviewed and it says they're denied for Social Security disability insurance, that's okay. That just means that Social Security has run their Social Security number, determined that they did not ever work in the US, and are no longer going to process their application for that specific program. However, their SSI application will continue to move forward because that person is still eligible for that program. So something that can be really confusing if you're new to this process, but important to kind of know that difference, and so you can educate your client so that they aren't concerned if they're receiving a letter that says they're denied for the SSDI program. So continuing to talk about eligibility, let's talk about immigration statuses and which will qualify your client to apply for SSI benefits. SSI is a program that's used by many American citizens and has relatively few immigration statuses that are also eligible. Those who come into the U.S. as refugees who've been granted asylum have SIV status, Ukrainian and Afghan parolees with certain date restrictions, and other similar immigration statuses do qualify for SSI. The Social Security Administration has a page called the Spotlight on SSI Benefits for Non-Citizens, which is linked on the bottom of this page, and goes through very specifically which categories of non-citizen will be eligible for SSI benefits. It's really useful to keep this page handy for a few reasons. One is that the rules around parolee eligibility may change. Right now, Ukrainian and Afghan parolees qualify, but there are certain date restrictions, as I mentioned, and you can see updates about that on this page. The other reason is that sometimes SSI representatives might not be familiar with the fact that certain non-citizen statuses do qualify for SSI. As representatives who, process many SSI claims and work with different populations, but mostly American citizens, they might not be familiar that non-citizens even qualify for SSI benefits. In my experience, I've had to provide this page to SSI representatives on occasion to show that refugees do qualify and are eligible for SSI benefits. So having this knowledge and this resource in your back pocket can help you advocate for your client if necessary in those situations. One other important note about non-citizens applying for SSI is that they can only get SSI benefits for 7 years from the date that they were granted their eligible immigration status. So for refugees, SIVs, and others who entered the U.S. with an eligible status, this is the date that they arrived. For asylees and others that were granted an immigration status after their arrival in the U.S. that qualifies for SSI, this is the date that they were granted that status. If your client does not gain citizenship within 7 years from that date, their SSI benefits will be stopped. So it's important to ensure that clients are aware of this rule if they are approved for SSI benefits. And there's a link on this slide that has some more information and tips from the Social Security Administration about how to potentially expedite a citizenship application if your client is close to reaching that bar. So now that you know some information about the basics of what SSI is and who is possibly eligible, let's go through briefly how to actually start the application. The easiest way to do so is to either call the local office, which is based on your applicant's address where they're living, call the national office, or submit a request on the Social Security website for an SSI interview. If you submit the request online, Social Security will generally follow up directly with your client about the date and time of the interview appointment. which is usually provided through mail and only in English. That might be one reason that you would want to call directly and schedule the interview so that you are aware of the date and time and it's not missed. Otherwise, you can also just educate your client and make sure they let you know if they receive any mail that has this information in it. When you're requesting an interview for SSI, you're going to be asked some general information about your client. That it will include your client's name, their date of birth, their address, their phone number, some information about their household, like the number of people living with them, what the household income is, and whether the disability is mental or physical. If you're applying based on age for a client who is 65 or older, you will not be asked about disability status because they are eligible based solely on their age. If you're missing any information that is being asked for when you call, you can tell them that it will be provided at the time of the interview, which is usually a sufficient answer. This is also a good time to let the Social Security representative know that your client will need an interpreter for the interview. But if you forget to ask, the client can also inform the representative during the interview that they need an interpreter and one should be provided by phone.